The industrial period, a period of a lot of turmoil, immense change, lasting from around 1750 to 1900. The context of this time period is that the Industrial Revolution had led to a mass population migration from countryside to the city. As the nation's industry shifted from agriculture, countryside, to industry in the cities. Urbanisation. As towns turned into cities, into megacities, community policing and the idea of collective responsibility and all these things were no longer going to be effective. Okay. Moving into attitudes of the time period, you have the belief in a criminal underclass. People, due to the low wages, unskilled work, and the mass unemployment, people were forced to commit crime in order to survive. And even if they didn't actively commit the crime, they protected perpetrators, and therefore authorities saw them as being complicit or just as bad as the actual criminals. Effectively, they had aided and abetted criminals and therefore were just as bad. The government response to this time of immense struggle for the workers, leading to an increase in crime and desperation, was simply false. For example, the Peterloo Massacre. Workers were hugely unhappy about their lack of rights and lack of opportunities to change their position, so they demanded a reform to Parliament. They wanted votes for the working class because at this time only the richest 10% of men could vote. So these workers met in St. Peter's Field, and this was supposed to be just a speech in which they were going to discuss their aims. However, as a result of the influence of the French Revolution in 1789, in which the workers of France had risen up and overthrown their monarch and beheaded basically anyone who had had any sort of influence, this meant the English government, or the British government, were absolutely terrified of working class protest. They were worried it would turn into revolution. So when this mass gathering of the workers took place in Manchester, the military, or the yeomanry, were called in to deal with the crowds, and they didn't care who was in their way. The yeomanry drew their swords and ended up charged into the crowd and killed around 18 civilians and injuring many more. In response to this, the government don't say, oh, sorry, that was our fault. In fact, they increase or try to increase control over the poor. They pass 6 Acts of Parliament. They make it expensive to publish cheap newspapers. This will prevent ideas of reform from spreading to the masses. People also now have to apply to the government for the right to protest. They also ban civilians training with weapons and also made it illegal to criticise government. This is all about authorities keeping their power. The other method they use to enforce law and order is by basically twisting or introducing new laws. For example, with the Tolpuddle Martyrs in 1833. These were a group of peaceful Dorset farm workers who formed a trade union to stand in solidarity, as in stopping wages going down. They say we won't work for less than a certain amount of money. The trade union was very scary to the people at the top of the hierarchy, as they wanted higher wages, and therefore this meant less profits for the rich. The farm workers, however, weren't violent, but rich farmers were worried about losing control. The Tolpuddle Martyrs had sworn an oath not to tell anybody about their secret meetings. So what the government did was they found an obscure old law from 1747 which prevented the taking of secret oaths in the Navy. They reworked this law to arrest the Tolpuddle Martyrs, these farm workers. They were transported to Australia for 7 years. However, there's a huge wave of public protests and they were released. The government did not scare the public into submission. The Tolpuddle Martyrs received massive support and only served 3 years in prison. The fact that they are nicknamed the Tolpuddle Martyrs, however, shows the strength of feeling that the population had towards them. They saw them as willing to suffer for their beliefs. Moving into Victorian London and Jack the Ripper murders, which we'll discuss more when we get to Whitechapel specifically. You've got the power of the press. The press sensationalised the Ripper murders and garrotting, as in choking people, so they could get readers. However, this often meant that they criticised the police force, making the job of the police harder. They made it look like the police could do nothing right. They painted them as basically incompetent fools. Moving towards the work of Sir Robert Peel, this guy here. Robert Peel was Home Secretary, so had the power to influence significant change. Home Secretary means in charge of law and order in the country. In 1823, he reduced the Bloody Code. He had recognised that the Bloody Code was not working as a deterrent, so worked to reduce the number of crimes punishable by execution. He also introduced the Jails Act of 1823, the very same year. This paid jailers, so there was no debtors' prisons. It provided work for prisoners, although not all of it was meaningful. Remembering the work of the prison reformers, they wanted meaningful work so that people would be reformed. We're into that idea of a gap between legislation and implementation. However, this is a step forward as the prisoners are doing work. He also introduced women jailers for women's prisons and wanted introduced basic education for prisoners and inspections of prisons to try and reduce that gap between legislation, law, and what actually happened in prisons. Another thing Robert Peel did was introduce the police force in 1829, the Bobby on the beat. Bobby as in Bobby Peel, or a peeler as in Robert Peel. They have a certain path to follow. They patrol, they move around the city. They are following a certain route, therefore making them a visible deterrence to crime, and were always patrolling. They could attempt to chase criminals in the street, but this was hard due to the conditions in some areas, which we'll talk about more when we get to Whitechapel. During the industrial period as well, you'll also see the end of public execution in 1869. Public execution, along with the Bloody Code, had been creating a deterrent to crime. It had been about creating a deterrent to crime. It was deliberately harsh and public to create a spectacle. However, over time, because without many crimes punishable by death, the public have become desensitized to this, and it's no longer a somber experience. The atmosphere at public executions was no longer the somber, frightening experience it had started out as. It had become carnivalesque. It was like a day trip, and people enjoyed the experience. The crowds themselves often leads to rioting, and such a large crowd in such a small space led to pickpockets targeting the area. So the actual execution itself was creating more crime. Public executions began to create public disorder, and over time people had become desensitized due to the Bloody Code increasing executions. So the deterrent was no longer effective. The government, however, still prioritizes retribution and deterrence when considering punishments. Remembering, by the way, on that, the end of public execution in 1869, the key word there being public. The country still has the death penalty, it's just that now it won't be done in public. You've also got some prison reforms during this time period. The government's belief in retribution and deterrence. We will do prisons on their own in another video. But the government's belief in retribution and deterrence, combined with the influence of reformers such as Howard and Fry, meant that prisons became a compromise between retribution, deterrent, and rehabilitation. In the 1830s, prisons were built with clean, separate cells and work to do. New prisons were built with separate wings for separate categories of prisoner. Again, for more information on prisons, I will do a separate prisons video.